It's been 8 years since the last Ace Combat, even more since the last Ace Combat game that was set in the Strange Real universe, and finally we get Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown. If you've never played an Ace Combat game, they're more action arcade than flight sim, featuring planes that can perform ridiculous and unreal maneuvers while carrying hundreds of bombs and munitions at the same time. The first time you play Ace Combat 7, you're given the option between standard and expert controls, and I highly recommend that you play this game on expert as it allows you to perform much more control and maneuverability over your aircraft than standard. Standard fixes your plane to a horizontal plane and really only allows you to guide your plane turning left, right, or up or down. There's no rolling or interesting maneuvers that you would perform in a real plane. It's rather strange to me that they would call this mode standard, as it feels much more like training wheel mode, but it doesn't really add anything to the game really, and kind of takes away so much of what makes airplanes airplanes. It's kind of just pointless to play this mode. Like I said, Ace Combat is not a game meant to be taken entirely seriously as a flight sim. You'll fly up against dozens of aircraft at the same time, armed with special missiles that can strike multiple targets at one time. They've also removed the dogfighting mode that was found in Assault Horizon and gone back to a much more arcadey style found in Ace Combat 4 and 5. That isn't to say that you can't dogfight. You can still turn around and fire on enemies with your nose gun, but it's much less personal and more distant. Combat is held at longer ranges and dealt more with missiles in close combat. The story is told over 20 missions with a variety of objectives that make each mission feel unique. Some missions require you to fly under the clouds for missiles and radar cover, while others will have random lightning strikes that can disable your aircraft if they hit it, or guiding munitions that you have to drop down to the ground. My least favorite is the mission types you have to kill a certain amount of enemies in a specific time frame. It feels arcadey and boring, and oftentimes you're just flying around in circles strafing ground or air targets while desperately trying to meet the objective. And unfortunately, the worst mission type is the return of the radar missions from Ace Combat 4 and 5, where basically you have these radar sites that you have to avoid and dodge by flying between them. It's just boring and not very fun. There's not a whole lot that really goes on in these missions other than you just looking at your mini-map and trying to guide your plane between the different radar ranges. Fortunately, most of the other missions are a lot of fun and have very interesting objectives, but these two in particular really drag the game down. Now, if you've never played an Ace Combat game before, you might be a little bit surprised by its challenge. The missions are not only meant to be beaten in a set amount of time, but you also face against a gauntlet of enemies at the same time. You'll quickly learn to hate this noise, as missiles come flying in at you all over the place. And worst of all, your AI companions are absolutely useless. Oftentimes you'll be flying in a squad of airplanes or a large air group that does absolutely nothing for you, forcing you to do all the work, clearing out the objectives, killing the enemy planes. It just creates this incredibly frantic gameplay experience that always has you near death because all these planes are swarming you and you have to do all the work. It's also one of the few games I've played where mission briefings actually mean something. Not paying attention during those early briefings can really screw you over in missions because they give you key details, like if you're going to be fighting ships or airplanes or ground targets, which might mean that you want to grab a different plane. If you're going against ground targets, maybe grab an A-10 that has a really strong nose gun and a fantastic assortment of bomb options. As you progress through the missions, you'll unlock a number of new planes like A-10, Russian Su and MiGs, American F-14, F-35, and F-22, and even the Rafael and Mirage jets. You can also purchase new types of special weapons like new bombs, missiles, and even parts to equip on your plane, like faster reloading for specific types of things or faster turning. Graphically, Ace Combat looks fairly good. Most of their planes are awesome looking. I do wish the sounds, though, were a little bit better. The airplane explosions at close distances could be louder, and nose guns sound disappointing. This is a little bit confusing given that the game is supposed to be more of an action-paced, action-packed game, but it really lacks that sense of punch when you destroy enemies. Now, one of Ace Combat 7's worst things is the air-to-air combat that basically just turns into people spiraling in circles trying to get missile locks while flying around. It's dull and lacks the visceral feeling of dogfighting, and perhaps that is the state of modern air combat, just missiles everywhere. But it leaves a dull experience, and this is unfortunately why multiplayer is incredibly disappointing in this game. It basically just turns into people spiraling in circles trying to get locks, firing at each other. It's just boring. As you progress though, you can unlock new options like different assortments of attachments and parts, which are kind of cool, but I just found myself getting bored of it really quickly. If this is kind of your thing, you might enjoy it, but personally I just didn't feel like it had much depth to it other than people just spinning around in circles trying to get missile locks. There's also a VR mode with a couple missions specifically for VR that aren't in the regular game, but unfortunately I was not able to try those out because I do not have a VR headset. Now, as I mentioned before, Ace Combat 7 takes place in the Strange Real universe, and if you've never played an Ace Combat game before, it's basically an alternate reality Earth where different nations and continents occurred, and basically a giant event happened where asteroids were coming towards the planet, and a bunch of the nations grouped together to try and create super weapons to deal with the problem, which led to a giant arms race and later different conflicts over different problems that were occurring because of the impact of these asteroids. Now, it's set after the events of Ace Combat 4 and 5, which also take place in the Strange Real universe, and it's in Usia and tells the story of a conflict between Erusia and Osha. It's unfortunately not the most well-told story, and it really feels like a huge disappointment compared to Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies, which had an amazing story that told life under an occupation. In Ace Combat 7, you play as Trigger, and that's where most of the story development occurs from the player's perspective. It happens during the missions, but there's a bunch of cinematics that take place from other characters' perspectives, like the Scrap Queen, the Princess, Mihail, who's a warrior, and different other characters. And unfortunately, none of them are really that all interesting or well connected. It isn't really until the latter half of the game that the stories begin to connect, but not in a meaningful or interesting way. It really tries to raise questions about drones, what is a nation, but none of it really matters in the end. It's all just a cobbled mess. And this was a huge disappointment for me because I really enjoyed the stories of Ace Combat 4 and 5. I liked learning about the nations, the characters, the people that live there, the cultures, but none of that really happens in this game. It just feels much more like an anime that's done poorly than an actual interesting piece. Overall, Ace Combat 7 is an average game that gets a 7 out of 10. It's fun being able to fly all sorts of airplanes while carrying insane munitions, but it really lacks the same story of the previous entries into the series like Ace Combat 4 and 5, and it may begin to question what is the point of doing all these missions if they just aren't leading anywhere. The multiplayer in particular isn't exciting at all, which should be a huge addition. Where it really excels is in capturing that fast-paced, frantic, challenging mission structure, kind of like a game like Dark Souls in that regard. But it really fails at telling a compelling and interesting story with interesting characters. And even the missions in particular sometimes have a bit of a mess. I don't really like some of them, like the ones that just have you going for score objectives. I can recommend this game heavily for fans of the Ace Combat series because the gameplay does hold up, but newcomers might want to wait for a price drop. This game is just very average at best. Now, if you enjoyed or liked this review, feel free to tell me below in the comments. Thanks.